Each of our senses is specialized to receive and process a certain type of information. We call the type of information for a given sense the stimulus for that sense. The stimulus for vision or sight is light. How is it that light helps us see the world around us? How we see something, such as a tree, is that light bounces off its surface and into the eye. That light often comes from the sun, but vision also works with other sources of light, such as from a light fixture. Vision doesn't end once it reaches the eye. That is only the beginning. We have cells in the back of each eye that translate the light into a neural code that the brain can understand. And to be clear, these cells in the back of the eye, collectively called the retina, are considered part of the brain. However, much of the visual process occurs in the main part of the brain. What happens is, after the cells of the retina have started the initial encoding of light into a format that the rest of the brain can understand, they send signals containing the information from the light to the very back of the brain to an area called the primary visual cortex, which is part of the occipital lobe of the brain. A lot of processing of the visual information happens in this part of the brain, but it doesn't stop here. After some processing in the primary visual cortex and the rest of the occipital lobe, the information gets processed further by other areas of the brain. The further along we go with visual processing, the more we can make sense of and use that visual information. For example, visual information that gets sent to the inferior temporal cortex helps us to identify what we are seeing, what an object is. Visual information that gets sent to the posterior parietal cortex, on the other hand, helps to visually guide our actions with the objects that we see. To be able to reach out and pick a leaf from a tree, for example. Let's look a bit more closely at the nature of light, the stimulus for sight. Light, or electromagnetic energy, travels in waves, and these waves can vary in the length of a complete cycle of that wave, or wavelength. A wavelength is measured as the distance between one peak of the wave to the next peak. It is basically the frequency of the wave. Light waves can vary from huge kilometer-sized wavelengths, like we see on the right, to infinitesimal wavelengths less than a trillionth of a meter long, like we see on the left. However, humans are blind to most of this electromagnetic spectrum of light. See this tiny portion of the spectrum right here? That is the visual spectrum. This is the only portion of the whole electromagnetic spectrum that humans can see. Humans can see light that has wavelengths ranging from about 400 to 700 nanometers. To put that size into perspective, 1 nanometer is 1 billionth of a meter, so we are talking quite small. So 400 to 700 nanometers is all humans can see. Any light of a wavelength outside of that range, so starting with the ultraviolet on the lower end and infrared on the higher end, humans are blind to. Our eyes are not designed to detect it. You may have started to notice too that different wavelengths of the visible spectrum correspond to different colors. Indeed, light within the visible spectrum with a longer wavelength might appear more red to us, while light with a shorter wavelength within the visible spectrum might appear more purple. That's all color is, our visual system's translation of the wavelength of light. Pretty cool. So we just looked at how the wavelength of light determines what we see, specifically what hue or color light appears to be. The height of the light wave, or the amplitude, also determines what we see. The amplitude of the wave corresponds with the intensity of the light, how much light or how much energy there is. The greater the amplitude or intensity of the wave, the brighter the light will be. So we have hue as determined by wavelength and intensity as determined by the amplitude of the wave. There is one more relevant feature of light that determines what we see, and that is saturation, or how pure the light is. Does the light mostly consist of similar wavelengths contributing to a bold, saturated color? Or does it have a mix of different wavelengths, contributing to more of an achromatic light of white, gray, or black, depending upon the level of intensity? Here's another way to visualize the effect of these three different characteristics of light on our perception of that light. Hue, or the color that we see, is determined by the wavelength of the light. Intensity, or how bright the light is determined by the amplitude of the light wave. And saturation, or how bold or pure the color is determined by how many other differing wavelengths are mixed together. Greater mixing of a variety of wavelengths results in light appearing achromatic, or white, gray, or black, depending upon the intensity of the light. Now that this video is over, consider briefly writing down from memory what you have learned. This sort of practice, retrieving from memory, is one of the best things you can do to remember what you just learned.